How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday afternoon, Erev Shabbos. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Renee in Indiana, Joe in the Inland Empire, Guy in Ohio, Nancy in North Carolina, Gordo in Scotland, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Shandora in the Bronx, Leona, Sue in Illinois, Marjorie in Georgia, Alan in New York City. I got a sneeze coming. It'll get here soon, I guess. Okay, our daf today is page 149 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 7 here in chapter 9. We're picking this up about halfway down, actually only a third of the way down, page 148b, because we did a double yesterday. Here we go. Rav Acha bar Minyumi says that Rav Nachman says, with regard to a person on his deathbed who wrote a deed granting all of his generally known property to others, right? So this is all based on what we've been discussing of our Mishnah, that if someone on his deathbed grants all of his property as a gift to somebody, leaving nothing for himself, and then he recovers, makes the miraculous recovery, and is going to go on living, leaves his deathbed. So if he gave all of his property while he was on his deathbed, this is understood to mean that he was only giving it away on the condition that he dies, because he didn't leave anything for himself to live off of if he should recover. So if he gave everything away, we understand that the gift was conditional on his dying, and since he didn't die, the entire gift is retracted. But if while on his deathbed he reserved something for himself, so then it's as if he's saying, if I make it, okay, then I have something to live off, but I want you to have all of this. So the gift is valid. And when he recovers, he doesn't get back everything that he gave to this recipient, this gift recipient, so long as he reserves something for himself. So now we're challenging a nuance of that, right? Rav Acha bar Minyumi, in the name of Rav Nachman, says, okay, well, with regard to this person on his deathbed, and he wrote a deed granting all of his generally known property, right? So it's not all his property, it's all the property that's known. Is that the same as all of his property, or is it not all of his property? So he said a deed granting all of his generally known property, gave that to someone, and he then recovered, so he cannot retract it, as we are concerned that perhaps he does have property in another province that he reserved for himself, in which case the gift is valid even if he recovered. Now here what it seems to be saying is not that the person said, I'm giving you all the property that I know about. Maybe what he's saying is what the people who are in the room, they know about him, that he owns 2 houses, right? And he gave away both of those houses. So it seems that he gave away all of his known property. But maybe he has some property somewhere else that they don't know about. So he didn't give everything away, in which case those 2 houses that he did give away, once he recovers, it remains a gift. Like he doesn't get it back because he reserved something for himself. The problem here is we're not sure. Did he reserve something for himself? Does he know if he reserves something for himself? Is he giving away everything that he knows about, but he's saying there might be something that I don't know about? Or is he saying, I'm giving everything away, or he says, I'm giving away these 2 houses, and the people in the room that know him think, well, that's all he's got, but somebody else says, well, maybe he's got something else that we don't know about. So let's keep reading. The Gemara asks, well, as for the Mishnah, which teaches if he did not reserve for himself any amount of land and he recovered, then his gift is not valid. Well, how can you find these circumstances? If the way we're looking at this new teaching is that he might have something else somewhere else that we don't know about, or maybe even he doesn't know about, well, that's always a possibility. Then how can you ever say that somebody gave away everything, right? Because maybe there's something he doesn't know about, and he just wasn't able to include that in the gift because he didn't know about it. But if we're always going to be concerned for that possibility, then we're never going to say that he gave everything away. And therefore, if he recovers, he's not going to be able to get any of it back because there's this possibility that he reserves something for himself. How can we ever find these circumstances where we know he gave everything away? And Rav Chama said, our Mishnah is referring to a case where he says, all my property. Now it doesn't matter whether he knows about it or whether he doesn't know about it, whether we know about it, whether he doesn't know about it. What he said is, everything I own, I'm giving to so-and-so. So that's where for sure he didn't reserve anything for himself. And then if he recovers, the entire gift is invalidated because he was only going to give everything away, assuming that he's dead. And now that he hasn't died, he doesn't mean to give all of that away. And so he doesn't. Now, Marbar Rav Ashi said that our Mishnah is referring to a case where our presumption is that he does not have property elsewhere. And if we're saying that's a legal presumption of the court, if for somebody to then come and say, well, what he gave me, I'm going to keep it, even though he recovered because he might have some property elsewhere, well, you're going to have to prove that he has property elsewhere. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to keep that huge gift that he gave you. That's that topic. Now another new topic. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed. Is a partial retraction of the gift considered a retraction of the entire gift, or it is not considered a retraction of the entire gift? So imagine somebody's on his deathbed, and he's on there for some amount of time. Maybe it's days, maybe it's weeks, maybe it's hours, but he has enough time that he gives, let's say, all of his property to, some cousin. We're talking about not his if he has 2 sons, he might gift it to one of the sons, and then that one son is going to get it all, and the other son is going to be out of luck. Or maybe he doesn't have heirs, and he's just deciding to give it all to one particular cousin. And then he thinks about it some more, and then he says, you know what, I don't want to give everything to that cousin. I want to give some of it at least to this other cousin, right? So I have a cousin in New York, and I have a cousin in Cleveland. And at first he thought he'd just give everything to the cousin in New York, and then he says, you know what, I want to give something to the cousin in Cleveland. Now, at that point, let's say he says, I'm just making this up, right? I have 4 houses. I have 4 vacation properties. That's all I own. And I'm going to give them all to the cousin in New York. And then he says, you know what? No, I want to give 1 house to my cousin in Cleveland. Now, has he said, I was giving 4 to the cousin in New York. Now I'm going to take 1 of those back and give it to the cousin in Cleveland. That's kind of like our first instinct, right? He was going to give 4 to the guy in New York, Now he's changed his mind, and so the guy in New York is going to get 3, and the guy in Cleveland is going to get 1. But he has given everything away. Now, if he recovers, do we unwind all of the gifts because he gave everything away, and therefore he didn't leave anything for himself? And if he recovers, he didn't, leave himself anything, and therefore this was conditioned on his dying. Since he didn't die, all of the gift is retracted. The cousin in New York and the cousin in Cleveland, both of them get nothing. Or do we say that he initially said, I'm going to give it all to the cousin in New York? Then he says, I want to give 1 house to the cousin in Cleveland. Well, maybe at that point, the New York cousin actually gets nothing. Because he says, I'm going to give 1 to that cousin in Cleveland. So now he's starting to a redisposition of his assets. And maybe he's thinking about the other 3, who am I going to give that to? But he's already retracted the idea of giving it to New York. Not just he's retracting 1 of the houses from the cousin in New York, but maybe we say that a partial retraction is a complete retraction. He's starting over. Now in the re-giving of gifts, he's given 1 to the guy in Cleveland, and the other 3, we don't know who he was going to give them to. Or do we say that a partial retraction is a partial retraction? Let's keep reading. So with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed, is a partial retraction of the gift considered a retraction of the entire gift? Or is it not considered a retraction of the entire gift? So the Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. If one gave all of his property to the first recipient, and then he partially retracted his gift and gave part of the property to the second recipient, like what I just said, I'm going to give all 4 houses to the cousin in New York. Actually, I'm going to give 1 house to the cousin in Cleveland. So it sounds like a partial retraction, right? So let's start again. If one gave all his property to the first recipient and then he partially retracted his gift and gave part of his property to the second recipient, so the second recipient acquired his gift, but the first recipient did not acquire anything. The cousin in New York gets nothing. The cousin in Cleveland gets 1 house. The other 3, if this guy recovers, right, he's going to keep them. If he doesn't recover, who gets them? His heirs? Sounds like it doesn't go to the cousin in Cleveland, in New York. And what? Is it not referring to a case where the giver died, right? He didn't recover. And the reason that the first recipient does not acquire anything is that a partial retraction is considered a retraction of the entire gift. That's the first solution to our dilemma. Now, the Gemara rejects this explanation. No. Our Baraisa, or this Baraisa that we're now discussing, is referring to a case where the giver did not die. He recovered. The first gift was invalidated because when he gave everything to one person and then he later recovered, okay, so then we've already seen when you give everything away and then you recover, the gift is entirely invalidated because he was thinking, I'm going to die. I didn't leave anything for myself to live on. Obviously, this gift was made conditional on his dying, and he didn't die. So that's why the cousin in New York gets nothing, because when he made a gift to the cousin in New York, he gave him everything. And then he recovered, so the guy in New York ends up with nothing. But what about the fact that in between making the gift to the cousin in New York and recovering, he also made this gift of only 1 of the houses to the cousin in Cleveland. So the first gift was invalidated because he left nothing for himself, whereas the second gift remained valid since he gave only part of his property. Had he died, the first recipient would have received the remainder, as the giver retracted only part of the first gift, which he gave to the second recipient. Right? So if he died, then yeah, the cousin in Cleveland would get 1 house, and the cousin in New York would get 3 houses. But since he recovered, the cousin in Cleveland still gets the 1 house because it was only part of his assets, and the cousin in New York gets nothing. Now the Gemara comments, so too, it is reasonable to understand the Baraisa in this manner, from the fact that the last clause of the Baraisa teaches, if he gave part of his property to the first recipient, and then he gave all of his property to the second recipient. So that's different. If he said, I'm going to give one house to the cousin in New York, and then a little later he says, you know what? No, I'm going to give all my houses to the cousin in Cleveland. So clearly the cousin from New York is going to get nothing since he changed his mind and give everything to Cleveland. But then if he recovers, Cleveland gets nothing because he gave it all away to one person and then he recovered. So Cleveland would get nothing. But what about New York? Does New York still get the one? Right? Because the Brisa teaches if he gave part of his property to the first recipient and then he gave all of his property to the second recipient, the first recipient acquired his gift because it was only part of his assets, and the second did not acquire anything because he gave it all to one person and then he recovered. So granted, if you say that the Bryce is referring to a case where the giver recovered, he didn't die, so it is due to that reason that the second recipient did not acquire the gift. But if you say that the Bryce is referring to a case where he did die, then both of them should acquire their gifts. Now, Rav Yemar said to Rav Ashi, and even if the first clause of the Baraisa is referring to a case where the man on his deathbed recovered, one can prove that a partial retraction is considered a retraction of the entire gift. So granted, if you say that a partial retraction is considered a retraction of the entire gift, this is the reason that at least the second recipient acquired the gift, as the giver reserved part of his property for himself. First, he said everything to the cousin in New York. He said, no, I'm giving just one house to the cousin in Cleveland. So that's a retraction. Then if he recovers, the cousin in Cleveland gets the one house. The cousin in New York gets nothing. If he dies, the cousin in Cleveland gets one house. The cousin in New York gets three houses. Granted, if you say that a partial retraction is considered a retraction of the entire gift, this is the reason that at least the second recipient acquired the gift, as the giver reserved part of his property for himself. But if you say that a partial retraction is not considered a retraction of the entire gift, then the giver should be considered as one who was dividing all his property between the two recipients. And then neither of them should acquire anything. Right? If the partial retraction, if he said all my houses to the cousin in New York, and he's still on his deathbed, and then he says, you know what? No, I'm going to give one to my cousin in Cleveland. And then he recovers. So if we say that the partial retraction is not a complete retraction, well then he did give away all of his assets. He has four. He gave three to the cousin in New York, one to the cousin in Cleveland. He's left with nothing. And then if he recovers, because he would be left with nothing, we invalidate the gifts. So neither cousin should get anything if a partial retraction is not a full retraction. If a partial retraction is a full retraction, that's why the cousin in Cleveland gets the one house. And when this guy, recovers, he gets the three houses, because at the time of making a gift to the cousin in New York, he gave all of it to the cousin in New York. Then when he made, I'm going to just give one to the cousin in Cleveland, that's the partial retraction that creates a full retraction of the first gift. And that's why the gift to the cousin in Cleveland works. And then when he recovers, the other three houses remain with him. I know it's super confusing, but hopefully we're getting through it. So the Gemara concludes, and the the law is, that a partial retraction is considered a retraction of the entire gift. So if he on his deathbed said, I give all my houses to the cousin in New York, and then he says, no, on second thought, I'm going to give one house to my cousin in Cleveland, then the gift to the cousin in New York has been retracted. Right now, the cousin in New York is due to get nothing. You find the law that is stated in the first clause of the Baraisa, both in a case where the giver died and in a case where he recovered. And you find the halacha that is stated in the last clause only in a case where he recovered. Okay. A series of dilemmas were raised before the sages. As is often the case when there's a series of dilemmas, they're telling you that, these are a bunch of sort of complicated nuances that were not resolved, right? These are going to end up in a teiku. if a person on his deathbed consecrated all of his property to the temple treasury. He consecrated his property. And subsequently he recovered. Well, then what is the law? Do we say that in any case that concerns consecrated property, the assumption is that he resolves to transfer the property unconditionally? Because this is a consecration. It's different than a gift to a human. And therefore the consecration is valid even if he recovers. Or perhaps in any matter that concerns himself, he does not resolve to transfer the property unconditionally. Right? Do we say that when he consecrated all the property of the Holy Temple, well, just like he wouldn't have given it all away to his cousin if he knew he was going to recover, and therefore when he recovers, we invalidate the entire gift. Well, also if he was consecrated to the temple treasury, since he gave away all his property, and if he recovers, he's leaving himself with nothing to live off, then clearly his gift to the temple treasury was also conditioned on his dying, and since he didn't die, he didn't consecrate. So we invalidate the consecration. That's what it would seem like, but we're not sure. And furthermore, if a person on his deathbed declared all of his property ownerless, then what is the law? He's not giving it to the cousin in New York. He's not giving it to the temple treasury. He just says, you know what? It's ownerless. Whoever comes in and claims it, they can have it. Do we say, but he said that about all his property. So do we say that since declaring his property ownerless is for the benefit of the poor as well as the rich, it involves the potential mitzvah of providing for the poor, and therefore the assumption is that he resolves to transfer the property, i.e. declare it ownerless, unconditionally, right? Whether he recovers or not, whether he dies or not. Or perhaps in any matter that concerns himself, he does not resolve to transfer the property unconditionally. He's only saying it's ownerless because he expects to die. And if he doesn't die, then he wouldn't have declared it ownerless, so we invalidate that declaration. Furthermore, if a person on his deathbed divided all of his property to be distributed to the poor, then what is the law? Do we say that with regard to charity, the assumption is that he certainly resolves to transfer the property unconditionally, whether he dies or not? Or perhaps in any matter that concerns himself, meaning he's not going to leave himself unprovided for so that he now becomes a charity case. So he does not resolve to transfer the property unconditionally. He was only giving it away to the poor because he thought he would die. And if he doesn't die, we invalidate that transfer to the poor. But in all, since we're not sure which way it is, so the Gemara concludes, these dilemmas shall stand unresolved. Meaning that if somebody actually did this in the real world, right? He says he's lying on his deathbed and he says, okay, I hereby give everything to charity, leaving himself nothing. And then he recovers. So was his gift to charity valid or not? We don't have a halacha, right? The dilemma is that these dilemmas stand unresolved. So since they're unresolved, what would happen is if the money had actually been transferred to the poor, then he would not have the legal weight to say, I only meant to transfer to the poor if I died. We don't have a halacha that he could rely on. So he would have to rely on other facts and testimony and establish it, but he doesn't have an established legal principle that he could rely on. Or if he hadn't yet made the transfer to the poor, and that, whatever charitable organization that stood to receive it, they come and say, hey, you promised to give it to the poor when you're on your deathbed. Give it to us. And he says, well, I got better. Now I'm not giving it to you. They don't have a legal principle that they can stand on because it was teku, right? So whoever is seeking to extract the money from the other would have the burden of proof. And they would have to establish, through testimony, etc., all kinds of other stuff. But they couldn't rely on this legal principle because it was unresolved. And now the Gemara presents another version of the same series of dilemmas, but worded a little differently. If a person on his deathbed consecrated all his property to the temple treasury, what is the law? If he declared all his property ownerless, what is the law? If he divided all of his property to be distributed to the poor, what is the law? These dilemmas shall stand unresolved. Teku. Rav Sheshes says, if one says, so-and-so shall take my property, or so-and-so shall gain possession of my property, or so-and-so shall take possession, so-and-so shall take my property, or so-and-so shall gain possession of my property, or so-and-so shall take possession of my property, or he shall acquire my property. All of these are terms that denote the bestowal of gifts. He didn't say, I hereby gift my property to so-and-so. He used different language, but the Gemara is telling us that that language, we do say it's the equivalent of, I hereby gift my property to so-and-so. It was taught in a baraisa. If one says, presumably a guy on his deathbed, if one says, so-and-so shall receive as an inheritance, or so-and-so shall inherit. These are also valid terms denoting inheritance in the case of one who is fit to inherit from him. And this baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, who holds that one can bequeath all of his property to one of his sons at the expense of the other sons, using terms that denote inheritance rather than only if he uses the language of gift. We know for sure that he can say, while he's still alive, gift all of his property to one of his sons and thereby effectively disinherit the other sons. But he can also, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, which we follow, say that I hereby bequeath all of my property to this one son. In other words, this one son will inherit from me and the other one won't. We actually follow that. We say he shouldn't do that, but he can do that. A series of dilemmas were raised before the sages. Now we're actually on page 149a, and this is a short page. If a person on his deathbed says, so-and-so shall benefit from my property, what is the law? Is he saying that all of the property shall be a gift? Or perhaps he is saying that the recipient shall derive some benefit from the property? We don't know. If he says, so-and-so shall be seen in my property, then what is the law? If he says, so-and-so shall stand in my property, what is the law? If he says, so-and-so shall rely on my property, what is the law? And the Gemara concludes all of these dilemmas shall stand unresolved. In other words, he used very ambiguous language. It's not clear whether he's making a gift of his property to this person, or he's saying that whoever ends up owning this property has to allow this guy to come on the property and leave. You know, it's my vacation property and you have to give it to him for 1 week a year. But he didn't say that. He was just very vague. So-and-so shall stand on my property. So-and-so shall use my property. So-and-so shall visit my property. What does that actually mean? We don't know. There's no legal principle to define it. So if such a case came up, the one seeking to extract property or money from the defendant would have to prove, it would bear the burden of proof based on some other legal principle, or he would lose in that litigation. A dilemma was raised before the sages in the case of a person on his deathbed who admitted that he owed money to a certain person, where it is possible that he did not actually owe him money. Then what is the law? Does his admission qualify as the gift of a person on his deathbed? Right? Like, I think I owe you money. Turns out I don't. But on my deathbed, I say, and I owe you $100. Right? And then it turns out, well, no, actually, I had a loan. I had paid it off. But now that I said I owe you, what have I done? Was I just making a mistake about a loan that I've already paid off? And so this is a meaningless statement. Or because I feel that I owe you and I said so on my deathbed, have I actually created a new pledge to give you $100 or actually gifted you $100 by using the language of owing? Let's see. Right? In the case of a person on his deathbed who admitted that he owed money to a certain other person, where it was possible that he did not actually owe that money, what is the law? Does his admission qualify as the gift of a person on his deathbed? And the Gemara answers, come and hear a proof. As Isur the convert had 12,000 dinars deposited in the house of Rava. Rav Mari, who was Isur's son, right? So Isur the convert, his son was a great sage, Rav Mari, whose conception was not in the sanctity of the Jewish people, right? So when his parents conceived him, they were not Jewish, because he was conceived before his father converted. But his birth was in the sanctity of the Jewish people, i.e. he was born after his father converted. And he was in a study hall elsewhere when his father was on his deathbed. Okay, so Isur was a convert. Apparently he married it's an interesting question. Like, if he married a Jewish woman, what difference does it make what Isur was? But maybe he was married to a woman and they converted together. Okay, so it's unclear about the status of the mother, but let's just assume for a second that when Rav Mari was conceived by his parents, they had not yet converted, but by the time he was born, they had converted. Okay, and then when his father died, leaving a very large fortune of 12,000 dinars, Rav Mari was somewhere else. Now, when a convert dies, right, so his children from before he converted are not his heirs. But it sounds like that Rav Mari was born after he converted. What difference does it make when he was conceived? Let's keep reading. Rava reasoned that he would acquire possession of the deposit for himself. As he said, how can Rav Mari acquire these dinars? If he attempts to acquire the money as inheritance, he is not fit to inherit from Isur. Since he was conceived before his father converted, he is therefore not halakhically considered his son. If he attempts, maybe his mother was Jewish, so he's a Jew. Rav Mari was always Jewish. Let's say that Isur was a convert who married a Jewish woman. So there's no question of whether Rav Mari is Jewish or not. The question is he the heir of his father who, conceived him before converting? And that seems to be a question, right? So let's read that again. If he attempts to acquire the money as inheritance, he is not fit to inherit from Isur. Since he was conceived before his father converted, he is therefore not halakhically considered his son. If he attempts to acquire it as a gift, the sages equated the halakhic status of the gift of a person on his deathbed with that of inheritance. Therefore, anywhere that the property can be acquired as inheritance, it can also be acquired as a gift. And anywhere that the property cannot be acquired as inheritance, it cannot be acquired as a gift. If he attempts to acquire the dinars by pulling them, which is a formal act of acquisition, he will not be able to do this as the dinars are not with him. He doesn't have possession of them right now. If he attempts to acquire them by means of a symbolic exchange, a pro forma act of acquisition affecting the transfer of ownership of an article, money cannot be acquired by means of symbolic exchange. If he attempts to acquire them by means of the acquisition of land, Isur does not have any land. If he attempts to acquire them by means of verbal instruction made by his father in the presence of all three parties, i.e. the giver, the recipient, and the bailee, well, if he sends for me, the bailee, I shall not go, as without the presence of the bailee, he cannot transfer ownership of the money. Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, objected to this. Why is Rav Mari unable to acquire the money? Now, I want to just make sure that we understand something. It's not that Rava is attempting to steal money that he knew perfectly well Isur wanted to go to his son, Rav Mari. What Rava is saying is we have a halakhic problem here, and we need to understand exactly what it is to avoid situations like this in the future. It's not like he's trying to make it all his own, right? So that's the logic that he has laid out so far. Now, Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, says, no. Why is Rav Mari unable to acquire the money? But why not let Isur admit that these dinars are owned by Rav Mari, and he shall transfer ownership of them to Rav Mari by means of a document of admission. In the meantime, a document of admission stating that the dinars belong to Rav Mari emerged from Isur's house. Rava became angry and said, they are teaching people legal claims and causing me loss. In any event, this incident proves that the admission of a person on his deathbed is a valid means of transferring ownership, which is what we were actually getting at. Hold on a second. So let's just leave it at that. Okay, page 149b. The Mishna teaches on page 146b, if a person on his deathbed reserved for himself any amount of land, his gift stands even if he subsequently recovers. Okay, we've covered that a few times. The Gemara asks, and how much is meant by the term any amount, right? We say if he reserves any amount for himself, then whatever else he gave away while on his deathbed remains given away, because he can reserve something for himself to live on, to live off of, in case he recovers from his deathbed illness. Okay, well, what does any amount mean? I mean, if he reserved $10 for himself, that means that the rest of the gift is valid? How long can he live off $10? So what does any amount mean? Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, this means land that is sufficient to provide for his livelihood, right? He has to leave for himself something that he can live off for the rest of his life. If he does that, then the rest of his property that he gave away beyond that will remain given away, even if he recovers. But less than what he can live off is not something that he reserved for himself. It's considered that he gave everything away then. Since he reserved something for himself that he can live off, one can assume that he wished to transfer the rest of the property in any event. And Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, even if he reserved for himself movable property that is sufficient to provide for his livelihood, his gift is valid. It doesn't have to be real estate, but it has to be enough assets that he can provide for himself if he survives this deathbed illness. Rabbi Zera said, how meticulous are the halakhic statements of the elders Rav Yehuda and Rav Yirmiyah? With regard to land, what is the reason that he must have reserved enough for his livelihood? The reason is that if he recovers, he will rely on that land for his livelihood. With regard to movable property as well, if he recovers, he will rely on it for his livelihood. But Rav Yosef objects to Rabbi Zera's statement. What is meticulous about these statements? The statement of the one who says the gift is valid, even if he reserved for himself movable property, actually this is difficult, as we learn in the Mishna that he must leave himself land. Why are you saying that if he reserves for himself movable property, even if it's enough for him to live off, that he reserves something for himself and therefore the rest of what he gave away on his deathbed is given away? The Mishnah said land. If he reserves sufficient land for himself. How can you now read into that movable property will suffice when the Mishnah required that land be reserved for himself? And the statement of the one who says that he must leave himself an amount sufficient to provide for his livelihood, this too is difficult, as we learn in the Mishnah that his gift is valid if he reserved for himself any amount. Where do you get that any amount means enough for him to live off? Abaye said to Rav Yosef, and anywhere that the term land is taught, does it mean specifically land? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah in Tractate Peah, verse 3:8, with regard to one who writes, i.e. gives via a document, all of his property to his Canaanite slave. The slave has been emancipated. But if he reserved for himself any amount of land, then the slave has not been emancipated, as perhaps the one on his deathbed reserved the slave for himself as well. So Rabbi Shimon says the slave always becomes a free man, regardless of the wording of the document, even if the owner reserved land for himself, unless it says in the document, all of my property is given to so-and-so, my slave, except for 1/10,000th of it. As in that case, it is possible that the master meant to include the slave in the portion that he is not giving away. Consequently, the slave is not emancipated. It's interesting, but did he give all his property to his slave? Right? And are we saying that then, but if he reserves something for himself, then the slave does get all the property. He's not emancipated, but he does own this property. Now, can a Canaanite slave own property? Or what actually happened here? Do his heirs now inherit the slave? Thank God slavery no longer exists. But when it did, slaves were treated like land. So if a man died and he owned a Canaanite slave, his son would inherit. So are we saying that if the Canaanite slave is not emancipated, if the man reserves something that he didn't give to the slave when he said all my property to the slave, so then if the slave is not freed, did he also, can he get all this property and use it to purchase his freedom? Or are we actually saying, well, no, he wasn't emancipated, and therefore anything that's gifted to him actually belongs to his master, and his new master is his old master's son? maybe it was a terrible, emotional roller coaster that slave was on. But let's keep reading. Now on page 150A. And I'm almost done, so questions or comments, get them in. Just going a little bit further on 150A. And just another reminder that tomorrow night, Saturday night, we will not have class because there's a special screening of our movie Guns N' Moses at Chabad of Pasadena. So if you're anywhere near Pasadena, you'd like to see our movie, go to their website, Chabad Pasadena. You can get tickets, and we'll see you tomorrow night, God willing, but no AT Daily tomorrow night, Saturday night. Okay, top of 150A. And Rav Dimi Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Lazar says the sages deemed movable property to be considered a significant reserving of property for oneself with regard to the emancipation of a slave, so that a slave is not emancipated when his owner gives him all of his other property. But they did not deem movable property that one withheld from his sons and earmarked for his wife to be considered a significant reserving of property with regard to her marriage contract. What does this mean? If one granted all of his property to his sons, but reserved any amount of land for his wife, so then she forfeits her marriage contract, she's getting something better, this real property instead of just some cash for the marriage contract, she forfeits her marriage contract. By not protesting the gift, she has conceded that she will collect her marriage contract only from the land that he reserved for her. Nevertheless, if he reserved only movable property for his wife, she does not forfeit her marriage contract. And Rabbi Elazar's ruling with regard to a slave indicates that the expression reserves any amount of land does not necessarily exclude movable property. Rav Yosef replies there with regard to the slave, by right, the Mishnah should not have taught the law with regard to land, but it should have taught the law with regard to all property. But since the former clause of that Mishnah teaches a law with regard to land, the Mishnah mentions land in the subsequent clause as well. This doesn't mean that it doesn't work for movable property. It just addresses land again because it already started talking about land. And the Gemara cites the former clause in Peah 3:6, where it says that Rabbi Akiva says, the owner of any amount of land is obligated in Peah. Right? If you own land in the land of Israel, when the temple is standing and all the tithing is being done, so you have to leave, when you harvest your fields, you have to leave the corners for the poor people to come and gather. That's Peah. The owner of any amount of land has this obligation in Peah, and also in Bikura, right? In first fruits, which, when the temple is standing, they're brought every year as an offering in the temple. And if the debtor possesses any amount of land, the creditor can write a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt, prosbol for it, so that his loans will not be canceled in the 7th year. And he can acquire property that does not serve as a guarantee along with it by means of money, by a deed, or by taking possession of it. This is like a whole bunch of legal principles that are being grouped together. Let's just keep reading. Rav Yosef concludes, and it is due to this reason that the Mishnah teaches the law with regard to land, but this doesn't mean that it excludes movable property. Abaye raises an objection to Rav Yosef's statement that the term any amount should be understood literally. And anywhere that the term any amount is taught, does the amount not have a measure? But didn't we learn in a Mishna tractate Chulin that Rabbi Dosa ben Harkanas says, when shearing 5 sheep, the sheared wool of each sheep, with the wool weighing 100 dinars and half of 100 dinars, i.e. 150 dinars, renders the owner obligated in the mitzvah to give the first sheared wool to the priest, right? So just as you're tithing what's called teruma, right, to a priest when you've harvest from, you have a field, when the temple is standing, you have a field in Israel, you harvest, the first 2%, you have to give it to a priest. Well, what if you're a shepherd? Do you have obligations to the priest? Yes. If you have enough sheep and you shear them each year, then if you make this minimum amount of wool that you're shearing from your sheep, then a portion of that wool is given to a priest in the same way that teruma is given to a priest. And the rabbis say 5 sheep, each of whose sheared wool yields wool weighing any amount, then you're obligated to give to the priest. And we say how much is signified by the term any amount. And Rav says a total weight of 100 dinars and half of 100, meaning 150 dinars, a weight of 150 dinars, provided that the 150 dinars are divided equally between the 5 sheep. This indicates that the term any amount can denote a certain minimal amount, right? So when we say any amount, we don't mean as opposed to 0. We mean any amount given that we've met the minimum quantity for that area of law. Whatever the minimum quantity is relevant to that body of law, any amount means that minimum, not more than 0. And finally, Rav Yosef replies to Abaye, well, there, with regard to the first sheared wool, by right, the Mishnah should not have taught the law with regard to any amount. But since the first Tana, Rabbi Dosa ben Harkanas, states a large measure, the rabbis also state that they require a small measure, and that they therefore call this any amount. But with regard to the gift of a person on his deathbed, the term any amount should be understood literally. I don't know that we've resolved this question yet, but just to reprise what we were discussing, and we'll continue tomorrow, or we'll continue Sunday, is if a person on his deathbed gives all of his property away as a gift, and he leaves nothing for himself, right? Then if he recovers, that gift is invalidated. He keeps all his property. If he did keep something for himself, then even if he recovers, that gift remains given away. Well, how much must he reserve for it to be that if he recovers, that gift remains given away? The Mishnah said any amount. So does any amount really mean if he kept $10 for himself, then he's now going to become a pauper for the rest of his life because when he was on a deathbed, he thought he was dying and he gave everything away to some cousin in New York who turns out to be not such a nice person and won't return the gift that was made to him on a deathbed? Or do we say that any amount means at least he reserved enough for himself that if he does recover, he's not going to be a pauper and he's going to have what to live off? Sounds like we have not resolved that question yet. Okay. A few questions from the class. Again, reminder, no class tomorrow night, Saturday night. Bill, what if the man on his deathbed makes a partial retraction because he recalled an error? That is to say, I give everything to Reuben. No, wait, I promised the china cabinet to Jessica, so I take it back. I give Reuben everything but the china cabinet. Is that the same or a different case? Well, the way you worded it, it sounds to me like his partial retraction was a complete retraction. At that point, Reuben has nothing. But then he keeps talking, and he's made it clear that he's given the china cabinet to Jessica and everything else to Reuben. And what it sounds like to me is the initial gift, everything to Reuben, now is partially retracted when he says the china cabinet to Jessica. Now Reuben lost everything. Jessica has the china cabinet if he stops talking. But since he keeps talking, he says, okay, what I want to do is everything to Reuben except the china cabinet, which goes to Jessica. So now he has given away all his assets, and the division is the china cabinet to Jessica, everything else to Reuben. Sounds to me like if he then recovers, Reuben and Jessica get nothing because he gave everything away. Had he reserved one field for himself, then even if he recovers, it sounds like Reuben would get everything except that one field and Jessica would get the china cabinet. That's how I'm reading it. Tom, isn't the point to try to establish the person's true wishes? Would a man changing part of his gifts think that he's changing the disposition entirely? As is so often the case, and it's said in rabbinic courts, and it's definitely said in secular courts, and I remember hearing it when I was in law school a million years ago. Tough cases make bad law, right? So the reason they're being meticulous with the language is, yes, overall, they would like to honor the wishes of this dying person. But if you go too far, and because it's tugging at your heartstrings, what you might end up doing actually is creating a situation where what the guy really wanted was that some gets given to him, the rest goes to his son, and because in one particular case, we want to honor the wishes, now in another case, children get disinherited who the guy didn't mean to disinherit. So we have to be very careful, and that's why they have standards. So yes, we want to honor the wishes of the dying person, but we don't just feel our way to that and then do whatever we need to do so that according to my impression of what the dying person wanted, which maybe was kind of vague, we're just going to set aside all these legal principles. We still have to have standards and principles. It's just that we're shading those standards and principles to more often than not fulfill the last wishes of the person. We just have to do it carefully. Bell, sorry to be late. The cast was taken off, and I have been given a brace for my wrist. Thanks for all the well wishes. Thanks, Salanina. I'm Yisrael Chai. A good Shabbos to all. Oh, Bell, thank you so much. Good Shabbos to you, and may you have a complete and speedy recovery. We say amen. Sharon, isn't the three houses in New York also... Isn't the three houses in New York also only a partial inheritance? So why didn't the New York cousin get his three, and the man is still left with the one house in Cleveland? I mean, when I was making that example, it was like he said, I give all my four houses to the cousin in New York. He says, no, wait, I'm going to give one to Cleveland. And then he recovers, right? So this is the case where if we say, well, when he was dying, what he wanted to do, was give it all to New York, and then no, wait, take one of the ones away from New York and give it to Cleveland, but he meant to give away all four. And then, so then we would say if he recovers, he gives away nothing, right? Because he gave away everything. But he didn't say it, right? The way that Bill put it, if he said, I give everything, I give the four houses to the cousin in New York. No, wait, I want to give one house to the cousin in Cleveland. At this point, the way the law is, New York gets nothing, Cleveland gets the one, because the partial retraction is equal to a full retraction to the first recipient. And now, even if he recovers, Cleveland still gets one. But if he follows Bill's plan, he says, I give everything to the cousin in New York. No, wait, I want to give one to the cousin in Cleveland. So what I want to do is give 3 to the cousin in Cleveland and 1 to the cousin in New York. Now it's like a new disposition, and he's explained exactly what he wants. He's giving everything away, so if he recovers, they get nothing. Even the guy in Cleveland gets nothing. Okay. And finally, Tom, if he uses that language, he shall take, etc., as a gift, does it matter if the giver does or does not say when the gift shall take effect? Perfect question. You really understand the matter, right? That's why the ambiguous language ended. I think, okay, so that part of the ambiguous language, he shall take, we say it is a gift. Well, what does it mean he shall take? Do you mean he shall take as of now when I'm on my deathbed and it's the language of gift and therefore it's now, not when I die, as opposed to the language of inheritance, which only takes effect when I die? So it sounds like if he shall take equals gift, then it doesn't need further a temporal modification because the language of gift is I give it to you now. If he says she shall acquire as a gift upon my death, then that would be something else. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again on Sunday. Sunday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. For those in the Pasadena area, look forward to see you tomorrow night, Saturday night, at the screen of Guns N' Moses at Chabad, Pasadena. And in the meantime, good Shabbos.